Now let's look at more evidence on the current Temple Mount that shows why it's the true location of the original temples. Peretz Reuven published a groundbreaking article in Biblical Archaeology Society in 2015, wherein he has proven that some of the beams of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the Temple Mount, date back to 2,000 to even 3,000 years old. Some of them have Islamic inscriptions written on them in Arabic that even indicate they were used and came from the original temples. Peretz Reuven also recently published an article about a recent discovery in Hebron of a mosque with an Arabic inscription dating to the 8th century AD, saying that the Dome of the Rock is at the site where the temple once stood. More evidence can be found from what is called the Sifting Project. In 1999, the Muslims conducted illegal renovations on the Temple Mount and disposed of over 9,000 tons of dirt mixed with invaluable architectural artifacts into the Kidron Valley. What appeared to be wrong turned out to be miraculous. All this material from the Temple Mount is being sifted, and unbelievable discoveries are being made that confirms the Temple Mount is the true location of the original temples. Among these discoveries are thousands of tile fragments that form the ancient tile floor of much of the Temple Mount, dating back to the First and Second Temple periods. These tiles were also written about and recorded by Josephus. Every bucket of earth that is sifted contains fragments of pottery, glass vessels, metal objects, bones, worked stones, and mosaic tesserae stones. These are the most frequent finds from the Temple Mount. The finds are dated mainly to the First Temple period and onwards from the 10th century BC till today. There are some finds from earlier periods, but they are scarce. In addition to these general categories, there are numerous finds of many kinds, such as fragments of stone vessels, approximately 5,000 ancient coins, various pieces of jewelry, a rich assortment of beads, terracotta figurines, arrowheads and other weaponry, weights, items of clothing, game pieces and dice, bone and shell inlays, furniture decorations, ornaments, bone tools, and so forth. Fragments of elaborate architectural members from the buildings, among them pillars, mosaic floors, colored wall plaster, and glazed wall tiles. All of these discoveries prove overwhelmingly that the current Temple Mount is the true location of the original temples, and that the Temple Mount existed long before the Romans arrived. Therefore, there is no way the Temple Mount could have been built for the Romans as a fort. Other important discoveries include finding 2 warning inscriptions forbidding Gentiles to enter the inner court of the temple. One was found by the Lion's Gate, also called Stephen's Gate, and the other in the northern part of the Temple Mount. These reveal further evidence that the current Temple Mount is the true location of the original temples. Now would be a good time to deal with the claims by some that the current Temple Mount was a Roman fort. The main argument they use is that the traditional site of the Antonia Fortress was too small to house a legion of soldiers. However, their claim is not based on historical facts. During the time of Christ and leading up to the Jewish revolt in 66 AD, there was never a Roman legion in Jerusalem. In 66 AD, the Jews revolted against the Romans and took over the Antonia Fortress, which was on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. As a result, Roman legions were sent to stomp out this rebellion. The Romans would wind up conquering Jerusalem in 70 AD under the Roman general Titus. The historian Josephus writes that in this destruction, the Romans destroyed the Antonia Fortress in several days. A simple Google search will reveal these facts. Therefore, there was never a Roman legion in Jerusalem during the time of Christ leading up to 66 AD. Therefore, the claim that the Temple Mount was a Roman fort is not accurate at all. Now, there was a cohort of around 500 or so Roman soldiers stationed at the Antonia Fortress on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, and then more at Herod's palace by the Jaffa Gate. There could also have been Roman soldiers in encampments around Jerusalem, as was their custom. An example of this can be seen at Masada. As mentioned earlier, it would make no sense that if the Temple Mount was a Roman fort and a legion was stationed there, that the Romans would destroy their own fort. Also, if a Roman legion would have been at the so-called Roman fort on the Temple Mount, the Jews wouldn't have stood a chance and been able to rebel against the Romans in 66 AD and drive out the Roman soldiers from the Roman fort. Now, some will claim that the mention of a quote by Josephus when referring to the Antonia Fortress indicates it was very large. Here's the quote from Josephus. By having all conveniences that cities wanted, it might seem to be composed of several cities, but by its magnificence it seemed a palace. However, in the same description, he continues and says, and as the entire structure resembled that of a tower, it contained also 4 other distinct towers at its 4 corners. So his description is a little confusing. On one hand, the Antonia Fortress seems large, but then at the same time, it seems smaller and resembles a tower, and also he uses the description of a palace. A city cannot be just a tower or a palace. So we must remember that Josephus is using an example, not what it actually was. He says it might seem. Again, this is just an example. If he was speaking literally, then the current Temple Mount that some claim was the Antonia Fortress wouldn't have fit this description either, because it was no way the size of several cities. According to leading archaeologists, it's very likely the Romans also had an encampment of soldiers by the Antonia Fortress. This could have been what Josephus was referring to as well. It is also claimed that a Roman legion was stationed at the Antonia Fortress because Josephus appears to use the word legion in one of his quotes. He talks about this Roman fort and says that there always lay in this tower, and he uses the word tagma, which is a Greek word. It must be understood that the original writings of Josephus were in Greek. Today, the English versions we have of Josephus are translations. The Greek word Josephus used, that some have translated as legion, is tagma. This translation is very debatable, and other translations of Josephus use the word cohort. Josephus uses the Greek word tagma for a unit, not necessarily a legion. In the Byzantine period, a tagma was a military unit of around 200 to 400 men. Josephus calls the Sadducees a tagma or an order, and he also called the Essenes a tagma. So tagma was also used as an order or a unit of people. In secular Greek usage, tagma means battalion, that which has been arranged, thing placed in order, a body of soldiers, a corps, band, troops, class, and so forth. It is used in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 15:23, but each in its own order. Christ the first fruits, then after those who are Christ at his coming. So to say that tagma definitely was a legion is to take the word far beyond how it was used in many other places. So as we've seen, all of the evidence supports that the Temple Mount existed long before the Romans arrived. There was never a Roman legion in Jerusalem from the time of Christ until 66 AD. So to base that there was a legion on the Temple Mount based upon one word that is debatable and translated many other ways, and most of them as a unit or as an order or as a cohort, is truly irresponsible. Now let's look at a couple quotes by Josephus that state the Antonia Fortress, or the Roman fort, was totally destroyed, even to the digging up of its foundations. Josephus says, "Now Titus gave orders to his soldiers that were with him to dig up the foundations of the tower of Antonia and make him a ready passage for his army to come up." Then in another quote he says, "In the meantime, the rest of the Roman army had in 7 days' time overthrown the foundations of the tower of Antonia and had made ready a broad way to the temple." What we see here is that Josephus records that the Romans destroyed the Antonia Fortress even to digging up its foundations. This means total destruction. After digging up the foundations of the Antonia Fortress in 7 days, they then entered on the Temple Mount platform to destroy the temple. Now, if the Antonia Fortress was totally destroyed, then how can those who claim the current Temple Mount was the Antonia Fortress? According to Josephus, the Antonia Fortress ceased to exist. The Temple Mount still exists today, so it's impossible it was the Antonia Fortress. Now let's look at a brief history of the Antonia Fortress, which will provide more evidence it was not located where the Temple Mount is. When the Greeks conquered the land, they identified the structure as key to the defense of the city. Later, the Hasmoneans, in around 140 BC, referred to it as the Baris or Baris. During the reign of Herod the Great, the Baris was completely re-engineered. In 35 BC, Herod built the Antonia Fortress, which he named after his friend Mark Antony, in the very spot where the Baris or the Hasmonean fortress once stood. Therefore, it should be noted that the Antonia Fortress existed long before the Romans arrived. Herod just rebuilt what already existed in the exact same location. So to say the Romans or Herod the Great built the Antonia Fortress on the Temple Mount is extremely inaccurate. As noted earlier, evidence for the Antonia Fortress and its existence can be seen today in the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, exactly where Josephus said it existed. We can see the bedrock upon which it existed, according to Josephus, and we can see holes in the walls that once supported a portico along it. Now let's look at some verses from the Bible that make it extremely clear that the original temples were not located in the city of David, as some would say. And if we would only let Scripture and God be our authority, it would clear up this whole matter quickly. God says that Solomon built the temple on the threshing floor of Araunah or Ornan that his father David purchased. This threshing floor was on Mount Moriah. 2 Chronicles 3:1 and 2 say, "Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah." Mount Moriah was north of the city of David, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. He began to build on the 2nd day in the 2nd month of the 4th year of his reign. After Solomon built the temple, then he would bring up the Ark of the Covenant out of the city of David to the temple on Mount Moriah. 2 Chronicles 5:2 states, "Then Solomon assembled to Jerusalem the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' households of the sons of Israel, to bring up the ark," notice, bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. So the ark was brought up out of the city of David. Then from this point on, the Ark of the Covenant would reside permanently in the temple that Solomon built which is also referred to as the house of the Lord. In 2 Chronicles 6, 10 and 11, Solomon states, "Now the Lord has fulfilled his word which he spoke. For I have risen in the place of my father David, and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. There I have placed the ark in which is the covenant of the Lord, which he made with the sons of Israel." These verses clearly state that the Ark of the Covenant was brought out of the city of David to be placed permanently in the house of the Lord that Solomon built on Mount Moriah. So, if the Ark was brought out of the city of David to the temple, then the temple could not have been in the city of David. This is very, very clear.